We are slowly beginning to be organized in this session. I think we have had the voice and the sound system is now working all right. I'm happy to be welcoming you all to this session. Walter Kigo should have been here, but unfortunately he could not make it from the Institute for Security and Development Policy. So Walter sends his regard. I used to work for him at the ISDP in Stockholm. And at that institute we were working on security issues and problems related to organized crime and the drug trade. So one of the first things we did was to describe how the drug trade and the illicit trafficking in drugs relates to different societal problems other than just being detrimental to one's personal health. And to make a long story short, the circle is now complete, and I think that you will see that there's an exhibition just outside where there's the coffee. It's in Swedish, but it describes various aspects of the international drug trade. How its impact to the environment and the criminality and the terrorism and poverty and so forth. So going a bit deeper on that topic, we have invited now one of the world's leading experts in this field, and it's Dr. Vanda Felbab-Brown from the Brookings Institute. And Vanda, she has been, when I contacted her, she was in northern Nigeria working on Boko Haram. But you replied, anyway, I'm very happy for that, and you were willing to come to Sweden. And before that, coming directly from Jordan. And I don't know any conflict zone in the world where Vanda hasn't been. Maybe I'm exaggerating, but I do think that she has the whole world as her scope. And she's studying insurgencies, organized crime, terrorism, the drug trade. She's part of something called the Global Drug Policy Program at the Brookings Institute. So also very interested in drug policies and the formulation of them. So I think we have no one better than to give us an overview over how all this is linked together than Dr. Vanda Felbab-Brown. So I'm happy to have you, and the floor is yours.
Good morning. It's very much of a pleasure to be here, and I look forward to our conversation about the intricacies and complexities of the nexus between the drug trade and terrorism, and between organized crime and conflict. As Eric mentioned, I work on quite a wide scope of geographic areas. I do a lot of work on Mexico and the Andes, but also places in Eastern and Western Africa, as well as South and Southeast Asia, and have dabbled with some parts of Middle East. Nonetheless, I'll make more general remarks in my talk, but in the question and answer period, if you are interested, we can get into specific places and specific issue areas. The focus on organized crime, illicit economies, and particularly on the nexus of drugs and terrorism received a lot of attention after 9/11, when it became obvious that belligerent groups such as the Taliban in Afghanistan or the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria derive multiple benefits from participating in illegal economies, including and particularly the drug trade. Often the drug trade tends to be one of the most lucrative of the illegal economies, bringing in very vast financial benefits. Moreover, in addition to fueling conflict and enabling the expansion of conflict and the entrenchment of belligerent groups, there was also recognition over the past decade and a half, that illicit economies such as the drug trade, but beyond the drug trade, have also profound effects on post-conflict environments, that they often significantly complicate post-conflict stabilization and reconstruction efforts in countries that have emerged out of civil war. So places such as Guatemala or Haiti are very prominent examples, but similar issues, similar complications apply to many countries in Africa, for example. Nonetheless, the phenomenon of the nexus between illegal economies and organized crime is not new, even though between illegal economies, organized crime and conflict is not new, even though it really gained a lot of attention after 9/11. In fact, many of these issues are decades old. What has changed is the focus that we pay to them. And what has also changed is the fact that many more domains are increasingly classified as illegal. So for a long time, for example, issues such as logging have fueled conflict, yet it was only in the recent decades that we have come to consider some form of logging illegal. Similarly, the extraction of minerals and diamonds have long fueled conflict, yet only in recent years, in recent 2 or 3 decades, we have concepts such as conflict diamonds. Nonetheless, despite the fact that the phenomenon is not new, and despite the fact that states themselves have often highly intimate knowledge of organized crime, and that states themselves often use organized crime and illegal economies for their purposes, and that they often exploit illicit economies themselves. Illicit economies are not simply the domain of non-state actors, of terrorists or belligerents. Many policy interventions to combat organized crime and illicit economies have not been highly effective. In fact, they have oftentimes turned out counterproductive with respect to crucial objectives such as mitigating violent crime, oftentimes have encouraged severe violation of human rights, for example. But they have sometimes also turned out ineffective and highly counterproductive, even with respect to the primary objective of such policies, such as, for example, to suppress the illegal drug production and drug trade. And that is because although illicit economies pose multiple threats to states, their effects on societies are often highly complex. Eric mentioned some of the threats they pose to states and society, and I'll elaborate on them. But in addition to posing their threats, they also provide benefits both to states and societies. And it is because of this complexity of both being a crucial threat and yet being a benefit to some, including some of the most marginalized ones, that designing effective policies have turned out to be so highly problematic. Indeed, large populations around the world in areas with inadequate or problematic state presence, significant poverty, and social and political marginalization continue to be highly dependent on the drug trade and other illegal economies for their basic economic survival and for the satisfaction of their socioeconomic needs. In fact, for many, participation in illegal economies is the only way to assure their basic human security, both their security in terms of getting access to food, but also their other elements of security of being able to prosecute, being able to obtain significant livelihoods and assure basic survival. And it also provides often, participation in illegal economies also provides often the only chance of their social advancement, even as such populations continue to be trapped in the nexus of insecurity, criminality, and marginalization. And I am here not talking about small number of people. We are really talking about tens of millions or perhaps hundreds of millions of people around the world that participate in illegal economies and oftentimes depend on illegal economies for their basic human security. Thus, for designing effective policies, as well as appropriate external assistance to governments, it is crucial to stop thinking about crime, including the drug trade, as merely an aberrant social activity to be suppressed. But it is necessary instead to think of crime as competition in state-making. What it means, though, then, is that in areas of state weakness and under-provision of public goods, an effective state strategy toward the drug trade, toward organized crime more broadly, is a multifaceted state-building effort that seeks to bond populations with the state. It's not merely a policy of law enforcement suppression of crime. Indeed, the goal of anti-organized crime efforts, and I would posit also the goal of counter-narcotics or drug policy control, should be not merely to narrowly suppress symptoms of illegality and state weakness, such as to reduce the production of drug crops or to reduce the extent of drug smuggling, but rather reduce the threat that the drug trade poses from a national security concern to a public safety problem, but do so in a way that strengthens the bonds between local populations and the state, that does not in fact thrust local populations further into marginalization and alienation from the state. So with this basic introduction, what are then the threats that the drug trade, particularly large-scale drug production and drug trade, pose to states? Well, there are multiple. In the first place, the presence of significant drug smuggling and also drug production can threaten the state politically by providing avenues for criminal organizations and corrupt politicians to enter the political space, thus undermining democratic processes to the extent that democratic processes had existed in the country in the first place. The actors who participate in the drug trade often enjoy superior financial resources and also significantly political capital that they derive by sponsoring livelihoods of poor marginalized people. And thus they frequently experience great success in the political space. In fact, many a drug trafficker has figured out that the best way to protect his illegal economic power is to become open. But conversely, many a politician has figured out that a great way to be a successful politician in countries with weak governance is to participate in criminality, and this includes the drug trade. And so we saw when, for example, cocaine smuggling moved to West Africa, how rapidly it swept through the political system of countries in West Africa, and how rapidly politicians as well as institutions, including police forces and the militaries, became corrupt and became permeated with the drug trade. When this happens wholesale, when the entire political system becomes deeply interlinked with criminality, such as drug smuggling, the legitimacy of the political processes is often fundamentally subverted. A very good example is Colombia in the 2000s decades, when it became revealed that the paramilitaries, one of the very vicious rightist armed actor that was also deeply involved in drug trafficking in Colombia, came to control at least 1/3 of the Colombian Congress. And of course use this control not simply to preserve their economic livelihoods, their illegal economic livelihoods and their political power that they acquired, but also to usurp resources from other domains of the state, including usurping resources from municipalities, such as transfers from the federal government to local municipalities for basic socioeconomic development in the area. So the first threat that large-scale drug trade and other large-scale illegal economies pose is one of the threat to the political integrity of the country, the threat to governance, good governance, or chances for improving governance in the country. A second very large threat is the one that is posed to the judicial and rule of law system of the country. As the extent of the illicit economy in a particular place rises and crime becomes more pervasive, as drug smuggling or drug production become more pervasive, the investigative capacity of law enforcement and judicial system diminishes. There's an old adage, if you want to successfully commit crime, make sure that a lot of people commit the crime along with you. And that adage captures the essence that the greater prevalence of crime, the more impunity rises, the more effective prosecution goes down, and it becomes very easy to get away with criminality. In the worst cases, such as in Mexico, get away with murder. In Mexico, we are talking often about the effective prosecution rate for homicides only 2%, which means that there is tremendous chance that if one commits homicide, one will be able to get away with it, and all deterrence capacity of law enforcement has essentially collapsed. Moreover, one threat to the judicial system and rule of law system and investigative capacity is simply the scale of the problem and the way in which it hollows out not only the incapacitation capacity of police, but crucial also the deterrence capacity of rule of law. But often the second aspect is that powerful traffickers frequently turn to violent means as well as corruption to deter and avoid prosecution. In the worst cases, killing or bribing prosecutor, judges and witnesses to the point of completely paralyzing any meaningful prosecutions. Again, Colombia in the 1980s provides a very good example, but we can also think of Italy during the 70s and 80s, for example, in Mexico in various times, including recently. But I also need to mention here that often efforts to suppress the production of illegal drugs can also lead to significant increases in human rights abuses perpetrated by counter-narcotics forces and governments that lead the efforts. And those are not trivial effects. Often the extent of human rights violation, including violent deaths of those who cultivate drug crops, can be very large, very significant, and significantly drive violence in the country. Again, we have many examples from places such as Myanmar during the early 2000s or Colombia, but also Peru, Bolivia, and other places. And this threat to rule of law, this threat to good governance, this threat to human rights cannot be discounted, and in fact it needs to be front and center of efforts to design effective policies. Conversely, however, while the detrimental effect of intense criminality, large-scale illicit economies such as large-scale drug productions on the political processes are rather apparent, it is often a significant and inappropriate leap of analysis to assume that the emergence of organized crime or extensive illicit economies will always necessarily challenge the stability of governments and threaten the power of existing ruling elite. The extent to which this happens, the extent to which ruling elites and governments are threatened and weakened by the rise of illegal economies, by the arrival of extensive drug smuggling, for example, is very much a function of pre-existing institutional capacity and strength, as well as the extent to which external drug traffickers make alliances with internal outsiders or with government elites. So again, very good example is the one I spoke about earlier in West Africa, where the emergence of cocaine smuggling through West Africa tapped into massive pre-existing smuggling networks. On the one hand, it strengthen some governments, strengthen them at least, or certain political elites, not in the institutional level, but at least at an individual level, by allowing them to gain significant political benefits, significant financial benefits from sponsoring the illegal trade. But on the other hand, it significantly hollowed out and undermined integrity of crucial institutions, such as, for example, the military in Mali. So to the extent that governing elites capture the new drug rents, a symbiosis between external drug traffickers and the ruling elites may well develop. And indeed, it can significantly extend the lease on life that undesirable governments have. The most prominent example, of course, is North Korea, where the regime has really become the master of existing on participating in a variety of illegal economies, including the drug trade, but also wildlife trafficking, counterfeits, and various other forms of crime. Myanmar in the 1990s and the 2000s decade provides another example, another very pertinent example, where the ruling junta was able to significantly consolidate power and persist as the ruling elite by participating in a variety of illegal economies. Illegal economies also have extensive and complex economic effects. Drug cultivation and processing, for example, on the one hand, generates employment for rural poor populations. I already spoke about that. In many locales that can involve hundreds of thousands of people who cultivate either poppy or coca. And I already also mentioned that this participation of local populations allows them to make their allows them to meet their basic economic needs. Often this is their only source of income. When drug production is suppressed, often these populations lose basic food security and in fact cannot access food for many months of a year. It also allows local populations to be able to access even the most primitive and the most basic health care. It might allow a family to send at least some of their children to school. It can allow families to buy any productive asset, such as a pump for irrigating their crops, both legal and illegal. So for many local populations, in very large scale, participating in the drug economy is often critical for basic survival. However, illegal economies also have complex negative economic effects. One of the typical phenomena is that the presence of an illegal economy, such as extensive drug trafficking and the influx of external dollars. Most often, dollars are the currency with which drug transactions are paid in, can produce rapid inflation. It often encourages real estate speculations and the rise in real estate prices. It also pushes up a price of land, which means that it becomes more difficult for even local poor populations to access land. And although their economic survival is linked to cultivation of drug crops, they often lose the capacity to buy land, and their only access to land is through sharecropping, which often means that they will have to pay the local landowner in drugs. It's a very typical situation in Afghanistan, where it's very difficult for rural poor to rent land without paying back in opium poppy, because it's a much more reliable form of payment than payment in Afghan currency, for example. And so the presence of illegal economies drives inflation, it drives up the price of land and access to land, it drives real estate speculation. It also can crowd out legal, legitimate economic activity. Thus, an illicit economy can often lead to the so-called Dutch disease, where a boom in one sector, in this case drugs, gives rise to significant appreciation of land and labor costs and drives out other economic production. So the more extensive the illicit economy, the harder it is for a legal economy to take off. But once again, the effects are very complex. It is often the dollars that the drug trade brings that generates spillover effects and allows for other economic activity, legal economic activity, to take place. such as the establishment of restaurants around drug trafficking routes, the establishment of hotels, places to sleep along drug trafficking routes, and the injections of money into an area of impoverishment also then allows for consumption of both perishable goods, but also consumption of productive assets or purchases of productive assets, such as pumps, as I already mentioned. So the extensive illegal economies in the context of poverty have very complex, very multiple and complex economic effects. And in some cases, the presence of drug trade can significantly harm the environment. Prominent case is Yemen right now, a place, of course, where the drug khat is cultivated. Khat is legal in some countries, illegal in others. Either way, it's a mild narcotic drug that very significantly requires water. And Yemen is already one of the most water-stressed countries in the world, and particularly in the context of the awful civil war going on there, the significant cultivation of khat critically depletes water resources. Similarly, to the extent that the production of coca leads to deforestation, such as in the Andean countries, including because eradication pushes coca into areas of forest cover, that also has negative economic effects because it it contributes to the destruction of natural forests. But once again, the effects are complex. What often drives coca into the rainforest in the first place is eradication of coca plants in areas that are not under tree cover. And finally, the presence of large-scale drug trade, large-scale drug cultivation can have very significant effects on the security of the state. In the context of violent conflict, in the context of insurgency and terrorism, these security threats can become critical to the very survival of the state. The nexus of drugs and terrorism significantly fuels conflict. But even in areas where the violent political conflict is absent, the drug trade can, in some circumstances, be extremely violent, such as in Mexico, such as in Central America. And I stress here only under some circumstances. In my conversation with my colleagues from Latin America, I often hear them attribute the extraordinary violence in places like Mexico and Central America, where homicides are in the tens per hundreds of thousands. In Sweden, I venture a guess that homicides are probably less than 1 per 100,000, or maybe around 1. Those are typical numbers in Western Europe. In places like Central America, we in some cases talk about 80, 90 homicides per hundreds of thousands in very small populations. In Mexico, the numbers are usually in the 20s at the national average, but can be over 100 in particular cities and particular locales. So those are extraordinary numbers, that extraordinarily violent numbers that often topple the scale of even civil war. For example, last year in Mexico, some 30,000 people, just under 30,000 people died as a result of homicide that are mostly linked to the drug trade. That's more people than died in Afghanistan last year. Just think about that, 30,000 homicides. And since 2006, some 200,000 people have died in Mexico as a result of the war between the various drug cartels, among them and between them and the state. Again, we are really talking about very vicious, enormously intense civil war if you think about the scope of such numbers. However, not always is the drug trade this violent. So I often have this conversation with my friends from Mexico, Central America, Latin America, where they attribute the violence to the presence of drug trafficking. And I point to Southeast Asia, where we often see very minimal violence, despite the fact that drug production, whether it's drug cultivation or the production of synthetic drugs, drug trade and drug consumption are same in the extent as in Latin America and often larger. Drug trafficking groups are simply not violent, more or less, in Southeast Asia, with some exception Myanmar, which we can talk about during conversation. So there is something else than simply the presence of the drug trade that drives violence, and that I attribute to other critical institutional weaknesses. And to the extent that in Southeast Asia we see very significant violence, it's often violence that's perpetrated by the state. I spoke about intolerable violations of human rights in the name of the war on drugs, in the name of drug policy control, and there is no greater example, of course, than the Philippines, where under President Duterte, several thousands of people, the numbers vary, but between 7,000 and 9,000 people have been killed in either police actions or in extrajudicial killings linked to state sponsorship of essentially state-sanctioned murder, a situation that is appalling and should never, ever be sanctioned, and should never ever be approved or implemented. So to the extent that in Southeast Asia violence is present in the criminal market, in the drug market, it is often violence instigated by the state. But let me return now to the nexus of terrorism, belligerency and conflict, to the places where there is political conflict and insurgents interact with drugs. What happens when insurgents come to sponsor, when terrorist groups come to sponsor the drug trade? And here we can think about groups such as the Sendero Luminoso, the Shining Path in Peru in the 1980s, the Taliban in Afghanistan and Pakistan. I mentioned ISIS and its involvement in Captagon trafficking. Groups such as the paramilitaries in Colombia. They are now demobilized, and their next iteration is the so-called bandas criminales, meaning criminal bands that operate there, or leftist guerrillas such as the FARC, with whom the Colombian government in 2016 signed a peace deal. What states often think about, what is the public image, is that when such criminal groups, or when such terrorist groups or belligerent groups penetrate the drug trade, they get large amounts of money. And that is often the case. It's notoriously difficult to estimate the size of an illegal economy. It's notoriously difficult to estimate the size of profits that anyone derives from illegal economies. And the numbers vary widely. So people will say the Taliban makes $1 million, $100 million a year from the poppy economy. The FARC at its height made $600 million a year from the drug economy. I find those hundreds of millions estimates probably less credible than other estimates, but I think it's not a unreasonable guess to believe that a competent belligerent group that operates in a place with extensive drug production and drug trade can make tens of millions per year from participating in the drug economy. And with this money, the group can significantly extend its military capacity. It can pay money to its soldiers, to its combatants. It can pay money to families of combatants, such as, for example, to widows. It can also buy much better weapons. It has far greater freedom of operation. Before a belligerent group resolves how to handle its procurements, groups will often have to spend significant amount of time robbing banks or even engaging in extortion, kidnapping to assure financial flows that are necessary for the preservation of their military effort. Such activities tend to be very time-consuming and often quite unreliable. The ability to sponsor the drug trade resolves those complexities of logistics and significantly enhances the freedom of actions that terrorist groups that participate in the drug trade have in conducting their vicious campaign against the state and local populations. But it is often then tempting for the state to say, since belligerent groups make so much money from the drug trade, if we simply eradicate the drug crops, if we destroy the drug economy, they will go bankrupt and conflict will end. This is the siren song that has underpinned many counter-narcotics policies in the United States for several decades, that drove programs such as Plan Colombia, for example. This is the counter-narcotics policy that has often been embraced by governments. That's the siren song of the drug conflict nexus. Yet it has not yet panned out anywhere in the world. There has not been one circumstance where the state and its international sponsors have managed to win a counterinsurgency or by bankrupting belligerent groups as a result of suppressing the drug trade. And I will make that claim even about Colombia, and we can speak in the questions answer period why I don't believe that the story of Colombia is again a story of successful drug eradication as a way to bankrupt the FARC. Why does this not happen? Well, for two reasons. The first reason is that military groups, belligerent groups, often have a variety of financial means at their disposal. And the more mature the group is, the more it diversified its economic portfolio into a variety of activities. So if you think of the Taliban, for example, they don't simply tax the poppy economy and the opium trade in Afghanistan, they tax any economic activity in areas where the Taliban operates. At the height of US military, NATO's military involvement in Afghanistan, where there were some 100,000, 150,000 foreign troops, the biggest source of income for the Taliban was not the poppy trade that thrived, but was taxing NATO trucks. Think of that. The Taliban was taxing NATO trucks and making by far the largest scope of money by extorting the logistical companies that provided security for NATO trucks. That was not a rare activity for the Taliban. The Taliban taxes international aid that goes to a particular place. It taxes national distribution programs that go to a particular place. The Taliban simply taxes anything. And that is indeed what belligerents tend to do. They simply tend to tax any economic activity that takes place in areas where they have influence or control. And so when one particular illicit economy diminishes, they often tend to have, or legal economic activity diminishes, they often have significant ability to adapt by switching to other illegal economies or to other economic activity. When during the height of the eradication campaign in Colombia, there was a temporary suppression of coca crops, the FARC and the bandas criminales switched to illegal logging and illegal gold mining, and were able to pretty much preserve their economic flows. Perhaps they were diminished, but they were not diminished at a scale that would make a significant difference in paralyzing or significantly weakening the military activity of the group. And of course, drug farmers also have a variety of means to adapt. They will hide their drug crops among legal vegetation or under forest cover. They will
replant after eradication. They can develop crops that are more resistant to the eradication agents that are being used. They will often rotate crops. In Myanmar, for example, eradication of poppy has led to farmers cultivating poppy crops on a three-way rotation instead of what used to be just one or two, as a way to maximize a chance that they will be able to obtain income. And it is particularly the case when eradication drives local population into significant indebtedness. The only way to which they can adapt is by growing a greater amount of drug crops. But the second reason why drug eradication has not yet led to the demise of one significant criminal group, quite significant terrorist groups, and why it has not led to ending conflict is because in areas where local populations are so dependent on the drug trade, belligerents derive significant political capital by sponsoring and protecting the poppy crops, the coca crops. So a crucial reason why the Taliban is still so deeply entrenched, why it has so much legitimacy, is that it protects the poppy crops from the state or the outsiders that would try to suppress it. If you think of the FARC in Colombia, where much of its political support had collapsed in the late 1990s and particularly in the 2000s decades, the one reliable source of political capital and the one place where the FARC continued to be deeply entrenched were the coca areas. Once again, because the FARC was protecting the livelihoods of local populations. Now, there are several factors that influence the scope of this political capital. The first one is the state of the overall economy. If the economy were rich and there were plenty of legal jobs, then of course local populations would not depend on the illegal economic activity, on the illegal drug trade, and their political capital would not accrue to belligerents. And there have been cases of that kind. For example, in the 1980s and 1990s, where the Irish Republican Army started participating in drug trafficking in Northern Ireland, it very greatly backfired on the group. In this case, the local area was not so economically deprived, like as in places like Afghanistan or Colombia. And not just that, not only was there not an economic dependence of the local populations on the drug trade, in this case, the economic activity was the distribution of drugs and the effects of which were, of course, visible problems with drug abuse and drug consumption. And so the local populations mobilized, and the Irish Republican Army, the IRA, in fact, went out of the drug business. Other groups did not, and some splinter groups like of the IRA didn't, but essentially as a result of political mobilization that opposed the participation of the belligerents in the drug trade, the IRA went out, reneged on the drug business, and in fact became a crucial enforcer against drug distribution in Northern Ireland. But that's quite a rare story. More often than not, the presence of the illegal drug trade takes place in areas that are poor. And then often the significant political capital accrues to those who sponsor it. The second factor is the character of the illegal economies, the character of the drug trade. Again, there is a big difference between cultivation of drug plants like poppy, like coca, that often employ hundreds of thousands of people in a particular locale, versus the production of synthetic drugs that will often employ only tens of people. So if in the case where the production is one of that it's not labor intensive, the production of synthetic drugs, the political capital that sponsors to those who protect the trade is much smaller. The third factor is whether traffickers are independent of the belligerents or not. Belligerents face strategic choices. The belligerents almost never invent an illegal economy. They encounter an illegal economy and they live with it, and eventually they try to tax it. In doing so, they can have quite hostile relations with local traffickers who obviously don't want to hand over a chunk of their income to the belligerents. So the relationship can be quite conflictual unless the state, as a result of its actions such as eradication or interdictions, pushes them together. The terrorists can also get quite greedy, and they can decide to eliminate traffickers so that they themselves control the illegal economy totally. And when that happens, they lose political capital because they can no longer offer themselves as agents of local populations, as agents who protect them from the abuses of the traffickers, who regulate how much money is paid by the traffickers to local populations. But the most significant factor at the end of the day is what the state does toward the illegal economy. And to the extent that the state moves in to eradicate the illegal economy, because it's tempted by the siren song of getting money away from belligerents, it often significantly hurts its counterterrorism and counterinsurgency effort. It fails in its chief goal of eliminating or reducing the financial flows to the belligerents for reasons that I outlined, and it strengthens the bond, the dependence of local populations on traffickers, and that on the insurgents, on the terrorists. And it means that local populations are not willing to provide intelligence, that they provide other protection and other resources to the belligerent groups. And often the belligerent groups thus become significantly entrenched. So what does all of this then mean from the policy perspective? It means, as I said in the introduction, that we must stop thinking about the illegal drug production and trade, crime more broadly, as merely an aberrant social activity to be suppressed, and rather think about crime in such context of weak governance and weak states as competition in state making. And that applies not simply to places like Afghanistan or remote parts of Colombia, that might very well apply to slums in urban slums in Western Europe or in the United States. In strong states that effectively address the needs of their society, the non-state entities cannot outcompete the state on a large scale. However, in areas of socio-political marginalization and poverty, non-state actors, including traffickers, including terrorists and belligerents, often provide greater socioeconomic benefits by sponsoring the illegal economy than the state does. In fact, the activity of the state can be seen as outright pernicious for the well-being of local populations. So, if the state simply responds in these circumstances by greater eradication of drug crops, by greater saturation of areas with law enforcement officers, adopting policies such as mano dura, male fist policies that criminalize large local populations. Such repressive measures rarely tend to be effective in suppressing organized crime or suppressing belligerency. In fact, they almost always turned out to be ineffective and often highly counterproductive. Instead, an appropriate response is a multifaceted state-building effort that seeks to strengthen the bonds between the state and marginalized communities. The goal of supply-side counter-narcotics measures, for example, should be not only to narrowly suppress the symptoms of illegality and state weakness, such as illicit crops and smuggling, but rather to reduce the threat that the drug trade poses from a national security one to a public safety one.
That then requires a multifaceted analysis and a multifaceted response of why, that addresses all the complex reasons why local populations turn to illegality, including law enforcement deficiencies and physical insecurity, but also economic poverty and social marginalization. In most cases, that then requires a complex development policy, complex rural development policy in areas of drug cultivation, but in cases of intense drug violence, such as in Mexico, complex urban development policy. That includes elements such as proper sequencing of drug suppression, of drug eradication with development activities. Oftentimes, drugs are suppressed first, and economic development is only promised after drugs are suppressed. These policies tend to be highly ineffective. In fact, the most significant case, the most significant success of development reducing or eliminating the presence of drug crops, Thailand adopted exactly the opposite sequencing. First, it provided rural development for several years before it started eradicating any drug crops. More broadly, it requires a well-funded, long-lasting, comprehensive development approach that centers on the creation of legal jobs. And that tends to be almost always the hardest element of any development. All the structural drivers of why communities participate in illegal economies need to be addressed, from access to markets and their development to deficiencies in infrastructure and irrigation system, access to microcredit, establishment of value-added chains, but also development of human capital, not simply chasing the replacement crop. Oftentimes, what is crucial is that the state is willing to concentrate resources to a particular area, both development resources but also law enforcement resources. That tends to be very difficult in democracies, because if the scope of this undertaking often is enormous, the resource requirements are enormous. So the state has the following problem. It can pick an area that's an area of very intense drug cultivation, or very intense drug violence, and give it adequate resources. That might, however, mean that other areas with similar problems will lack the same level of state intervention. And so particularly in democracies, the tendency tends to be to give each affected community a bit, essentially a handout. That, however, never addresses adequately the structural reasons, the structural drivers of the illegal economies. Concentrating resources and trying to expand resources, trying to expand the area of coverage, is often critical for successful state intervention, yet enormously politically difficult to undertake in areas of significant need. Successful policies often entail other components, such as addressing street crime, that often is far more problematic from the perspective of local populations than transactional crimes, such as drug trafficking. In fact, the attention of outsiders, of international donors, predominantly tends to be on transactional crimes, such as the drug trade, yet that is often seen as legitimate by local population. But as both the state and international donors are often quite indifferent or oblivious to street crime, that often significantly intensifies the reasons why local population participate in transactional crime. And it also gives both criminals and belligerents capacity to capacity to enhance their political legitimacy by themselves acting against street crime. So, for example, gangs in Rio, in the favelas, violent gangs, on the one hand are a source of tremendous violence that can be akin to warfare. They are also the distributors of drugs in the favelas and beyond the favelas, but at the same time they often act against robberies, rapes, other forms of street crime. Other important interventions often include providing access to legal dispute resolution and justice mechanisms. So once again, it is not the criminals, it is not the terrorists that provide justice that is rough and imperfect, but often far better than a corrupt justice that the state provides, or no access to legal dispute resolution mechanisms. And I want to end by emphasizing once again that effective state interventions crucially need to focus on the protection of human rights, reconciliation and nonviolent responses, and that policies that promote extensive violation of human rights in the name of suppressing drugs are enormously problematic and should never be tolerated. With that, let me hand it over to Eric for the Q&A.
Thank you so much, Vanda. A very comprehensive overview over the illicit economies and their impact on society to which the drug trade is a part of. I have many questions, but I would like you to ask them instead. So Thomas, you are from the UNODC, you will get a mic from me. And Thomas has been writing the World Drug Reports for I don't know how many years. So you're an expert.
97.
Yes.
First of all, many thanks for your presentation. 80 to 90% what you said, I would fully subscribe. So no discussion, not 80 or 90%. This is just the 2 points which you mentioned why I think we would be in disagreement is your statement that the reduction of coca cultivation had no impact on the FARC, that the reduction in Peru of coca cultivation in Peru in Alto Luaga had no impact on the Shining Pass. And here I beg to differ. We had looked into this last year's World Drug Report, and we spoke also with many experts in the area. And what we really have seen, at least it went in parallel. We saw a decline in the military strength of the FARC in the 2000s, going hand in hand with the decline in the coca cultivation of that area, and parallel to when they had less military force, they did less attacks. So now this goes from 2000 to 2013. When it comes to the period 2013-2016, there's the interesting and a very positive element that we see a massive increase in coca cultivation in Colombia, and in parallel an ongoing decline in attacks by the FARC, which is very much linked to the peace process. So this period we have to exclude because it's a very special program and a very positive one. So but before 2013 we really see this decline, and the same now applies to the Shining Pass story. Shining Pass story, Alto Luaga, it used to be 90% of opium of coca cultivation of Peru was the Alto Luaga. This was the traditional place where coca cultivation took place. Now it's 4% out of the total, it's almost nothing. And at the same time the Shining Pass, it still exists, but its importance is really minimal as it used to be in the early 1990s. So I think this went very much in parallel. Third element where we had the opposite was the Taliban. We had the clear increase in opium cultivation in Afghanistan. We have the increase in Taliban activities, we have the increase in Taliban strengths, and the increase in attacks and victims from the Taliban over the last years. Not always 100% parallel, but the global trend is very much the same. More cultivation, more opium production, more attacks by the Taliban. So, and this specific point, I think we differ in a position. Everything else you said, I couldn't agree more with you. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So my take on all three stories is actually different. It's of course very difficult to disentangle the multiple factors and multiple inputs that are changing in the places. So if you look at the Colombia situation, I argue in my work, in my research, that clearly you have significant diminishment of the FARC's military capacity vis-à-vis the state in the 2000s. But why? Well, people often attribute it to coca eradication. In my view, the far more significant effect was the significant improvements of the military capacity of the Colombian state as a result of many years of US assistance. So if you look at the Colombian military in the early 1990s, it essentially could not tie its shoelaces. It was extremely heavily weighted toward the tail, not the tooth. The official strength was something like 130, 150,000, but out of that, only about 30,000 were actual fighting soldiers. The capacity to fight was very weak. They had no capacity to mass. The provision of intelligence was essentially non-existent. That was one of the reasons why it relied so heavily on the paramilitaries to be really fighting the FARC. But as a result of Plan Colombia and US military assistance to Colombia for over a decade, by the early 2000s, the Colombian military is far more capacious force, where the tail-to-tooth ratio changes significantly, where it has the capacity to mass, where it has the capacity to organize counterattacks. The air assets also significantly increase, signal intelligence significantly increase. And so it's very much able to actually challenge the FARC militarily in a way that it could not for a very long time, for decades, frankly. And where I would attribute a far more significant counter-narcotics policy effect on the FARC is not on eradication, but what became essentially the interdiction policy as a result of military policy. What the Colombian military started doing was pinning particular frentes, particular FARC units in places where it could not move around. And so what it meant is that as long as the frente was in a coca area, it had to rely on selling coca paste, in some cases cocaine, to the paramilitaries, but it could not channel funding to other frentes. So I would give far greater debilitating effect to interdiction, and not just drug interdiction, but interdiction with the military strategies that was developed to pin the frentes. I would, however, also posit that since 2008, the military battlefield becomes essentially stalled. And coca numbers start going up again after eradication. Meanwhile, the FARC has deeply penetrated illegal logging and gold mining, illegal gold mining. But it can hang on. The bigger issue is that the battlefield between the FARC and the Colombian military is essentially flat, stalled since 2008, and that gives rise to the negotiations that secretly start in 2011, 2012, and more formally get underway later. With respect to the Shining Path, what really allowed, so the Peruvian story is a very interesting one, where the state had multiple times shifting between coca eradication as a way to defeat the FARC and letting up on coca eradication since 1982-83. There were essentially 4 phases to this oscillation back and forth. Each time where they launched into significant eradication, the Shining Path gained strength in the rural areas because the population supported it far strongly. Ultimately, what allowed the Peruvian military to defeat the Shining Path, the Senderistas, in the rural space, in the rural areas in 1990-91 was giving up on eradication altogether. In fact, there was a complex story where they gave up on eradication, where they launched very aggressive hearts and minds campaigns with the local populations. They mobilized so-called rondas campesinas, essentially militia forces, often from the cocaleros that were combating the Shining Path, telling the cocaleros they would be able to preserve their access to coca cultivation, and they even hired or they struck alliances with drug traffickers, including in the UHV, to provide intelligence on the Shining Path. So there were very explicit tacit deal made. The decision was to allow the coca economy to persist very robustly and to switch the political capital away from the traffickers and the cocaleros. And that was led to the demise of the FARC in the rural spaces, of the Shining Path. The Shining Path also made the mistakes in some of the strategic decisions of how we decided to switch from the rural spaces to the urban campaign, where it became very vulnerable and ultimately was defeated. And so, you know, the remnants of the Shining Path, like Alemio and Alepio and other commanders, were very weak. And so, you know, yes, we can make arguments about particular strength of coca cultivation correlating with the more or less good or bad year for the two units that survived. But I would say that their scale was quite small and that they really were not significant as military actors. And the defeat took place, the significant defeat of Shining Path took place because eradication was halted. And the Taliban in attacks, well, we see the rise of Taliban attacks because NATO went home. That is by far the strongest reason why the Taliban is so potent. And there are many other reasons, one of which is poppy. But as I mentioned, the Taliban taxes everything, and it is very strong in areas where there is not poppy as well. So, you know, very many complex reasons but the most significant rise of the Taliban strength since 2012 is that the NATO numbers have gone down from 150,000 to some 15,000. And INSF, the Afghan National Security Forces, continue to be very weak and very pervaded by enormous problems.
Mm-hmm. Are you brief, Thomas?
Very brief. Just one, and all of you said I agree as well. It's just a question of how many points you give to one and the other. So this is principle. So I have no disagreement with what you said now. One element which also I think played a role for Peru was the decline in prices, in coca prices. And the coca prices had to do inter alia with the shoot-down policy implemented by the Peruvian government after 1995, which meant the coca couldn't go out of the country and prices collapsed. As prices collapsed, there was no more incentive for farmers to really go into coca. So this was one additional point. My question, sorry, a completely different issue. When we did last year the story, we had the clear evidence of the links with the Taliban, the clear evidence links with FARC, clear evidence Shining Path, the PKK, and so on. Where we had really problems to find good evidence was the ISIS. Yes, we know Captagon comes out of Syria and Lebanon, but we found a lot of newspaper articles, but kind of real evidence, which is not a journalist writing something about it, but a little more, and even the books what we read, the end was a journalist article. So my question is, like we wanted to have the evidence, we didn't really get it. So do you have any more evidence of the production of Captagon in the area under the control? Because we got the impression that it was everywhere in all areas and not just the ISIS area.
So my sources are also journalistic reporting or conversation with local government officials, or in some cases with local researchers that have managed to go to places liberated from ISIS in Iraq and Syria. And the story is the one that you identified, that yes, ISIS is in it, but so are very many other actors. And that in fact tends to be the case. In Afghanistan, it's hardly just the Taliban that's in poppy. Everyone and his brother power broker is in poppy, including government officials. So, and that's a very, very important point, that illegality and the drug trade is hardly the domain solely of the opponents of the state. The state is very much in.
Mm-hmm. Any more? Bob?
Thank you very much for this wonderful presentation. In the description in the program, talked about the war on drugs as a component or a factor in the illegal market. And I wonder what you think about the concept of solving the problem by legalization. And I'm particularly interested in your thoughts about what's happened in Colorado with the legalization of marijuana, of the illegal market of marijuana in Colorado, which appears to me to be quite robust after legalization. And then related to that, I believe the legalization of gambling, for example, at least in the United States, has not had an effect on illegal gambling, that the illegal gambling is still very active and that the legal gambling has increased the market of gambling, but not stopped the illegal activities. And I wonder what you think about the potential for, what shall I say, abandoning the war on drugs in terms of this problem.
Thank you very much. So I first of all want to start by suggesting that drug control policy does not simply center on 2 points, war on drugs and legalization. There is a scale of policy interventions and policy design that exists in between. The war on drugs, as we conceive of it, premium on, in my view, premature suppression of drug robs, arrests of drug users, not just drug dealers and drug traffickers. Mano Dura's policies has been enormously destructive and counterproductive. That, however, does not imply that the only alternative is legalization. So then the question is, and there is a whole variety of policy interventions, policy design that can exist in between. And in my talk, I was suggesting what a state-building approach to drugs would look like in the domain of areas of drug consumption, of drug supply and drug smuggling. So the question is, what does one want to resolve with legalization? If the goal of legalization is resolving that there will not be any legal market, it very much depends on the circumstances and the design. So in Mexico, it is often suggested that if drugs were legal, the cartels would not fight, they would have no power. I fundamentally don't believe that. The cartels today are not simply in the smuggling of drugs. They extort legal businesses. In the context of very weak rule of law and very strong criminal groups or belligerent groups, they will move to other economies. That's why if poppy were legal in Afghanistan, the Taliban would still tax it, such as it taxes NATO trucks, such as it taxes international aid that goes to Afghanistan. So a lot of other things would have to click into place beyond mere legalization for the illegal market to go away. And by the way, I don't know what happened with the scale of legal versus illegal gambling in the US, but certainly in Italy, when gambling became legal, it became the mafia or the various criminal groups, it's not just the mafia, were able to dominate very significantly legal gambling and in fact use the legality of gambling for extending their control in other illegal domains. So legalization in this case did not weaken the criminal groups. For legalization to have the effect of crowding out illegal economies, several things would have to take place. The legal market would have to be cheaper. The legally supplied commodity would have to be cheaper than the one supplied by the illegal trade. That's not impossible to imagine. If you think of the US opioid crisis today, the crisis lies at the hands of US pharmaceutical companies that drove massive overprescription of illegal drugs. And in fact, the only reason why cocaine is valuable is because it's illegal. If the trade were legal, then a packet of cocaine would cost the same as a packet of tea. It's simply an agricultural product. So if you had legal market on a very vast scale, you could imagine that the legally supplied commodity would be cheaper than the illegal one. However, in the case of drugs, that comes with very significant problems, because just like with legal opioids, you end up with huge addiction problems.
So most states that contemplate legalization would not simply legalize without taxation, in the same way that we see taxation on cigarettes. And what did happen with cigarettes in Europe? The greater the tax to discourage use, the greater the illegal market that has emerged, with some of the illegal cigarettes often being more detrimental to health than even the legal ones. Another element that would be required for legalization to crowd out the illegal market would be, of course, the capacity of rule of law to act against the criminal groups that would not become nice criminals, that would not retire on the beach, but that would try to participate in the now newly legal economy. Would it be desirable if Mexican drug cartels dominated legal poppy production or heroin production in Mexico? I would posit probably not, because they are so violent, they are so brutal, because they so extort local communities, and because they significantly subvert political power. On the other hand, would they become the equivalent of the US drug barons and be very nice actors, give lots of money to charities and sponsor institutions? Well, that would be a different scenario. But either way, it would not take place in the absence of very significant coercive capacity of the state all of a sudden to act against those that it could not act before, against whom it was powerless, or where it had relatively weak power. But I do want to end that, again, the options are not, in the case of most commodities, most illegal commodities, the options are not legalization or war on drugs. Many of the war on drugs approaches are deeply destructive, deeply counterproductive. They are the source of violence. They destroy communities as much as drug consumption does. And one can imagine a very different design of policies that would be far more effective and far less harmful. It's essentially a free way of balancing the threat that drug consumption poses with the threat that the drug trade poses and with the threat that state policies pose. And I want to emphasize that, again, that state policies are often an enormous source of threat to local populations, to human rights, to crucial principles of good governance.
Speaking on that, the illegal cigarette economy is quite interesting also as an experience. At least in Europe, we have had, in my country, Sweden, it's quite a large proportion of criminal funds are being derived from illegal cigarettes. And we know that during the Balkan Wars in the 90s, insurgency groups and even militias were actually taxing cigarette trade as well. And we have examples from Russia and Central Asia as well. So would you maybe expand a bit upon that and see how a semi-legal criminal market, how would that look like? And I think that the question from Bob was, how would the criminal markets tap into and feed into the legal and the illegal economies? How do they communicate?
Well, I would go back to suggesting that it predominantly depends on what kind of criminal or belligerent groups you have. To the extent that you have criminal groups or belligerent groups that control territories, not necessarily control them, but they have significant influence, all of them tend to act in the same way, namely to tax anything in the area where they operate, whether it's legal or illegal. So if you switch the legality of a commodity, make it legal or illegal, but you don't resolve the pre-existing power of the criminal group, you will simply switch how you will simply switch whether the group tax is something that's legal or something that's illegal. I don't think it has significant effect in the absence of reducing the power of the criminal groups. Now, where it could have effects is in terms of political capital of the group. If, for example, you declare that poppy cultivation is legal now in Guerrero, Mexico, then the local population might be indifferent in its support between particular criminal groups that operate there, and legal agricultural businesses that would move in to sponsor their poppy cultivation. So in terms of political capital, that would make a difference. In terms of how the group would behave, I don't think it would make a difference.
Mm. Anyone else? Sometimes you hear a lot about billions of drug money being laundered in financial havens in the US and different islands. Do you have comments on that, on money laundering?
So just like eradication, anti-money laundering efforts tend to be one of the siren song in the field. Those who who want legalization, those who want war on drugs, everyone tends to agree that we need to get the money out of the system. Again, there has not been one successful case with respect to the drug trade, where the trade in a particular area was eliminated through anti-money laundering efforts. Colombia has some of the most robust anti-money laundering laws on its books since the 1990s, very comprehensive package, yet coca cultivation, cocaine production continue to thrive in Colombia. A significant amount of illegal proceeds move not just through financial systems, they move through trade-based laundering, through legal investments. However, we also have to remember that at the end of the day, criminal groups need to pay for large amounts of their activities in cash. So, today there is a lot of interesting development in the emergence of cryptocurrencies. We see that criminals launder money through online gaming, for example. But at the end of the day, if you are a sicario working for a criminal group, do you want to be paid in bitcoins or do you want to be paid in cash? A lot of daily transactions take place in liquidity. And in fact, what is more shocking to me than the fact that we cannot catch the vast financial flows that move through the financial system, what is more shocking is that we struggle so much in catching bulk cash through which most of the drug trade on a daily basis take place. It's also something that's very much a source of friction between the United States and Mexico, with Mexico hoping that the US would stop much more of the cash dollars that move into Mexico. The US keeps promising that, but has not successfully succeeded. But I tend to be quite skeptical that anti-money laundering efforts are the silver bullet. We have not seen them really act on an effective scale with any large-scale sort of systemic effect. So one of the most successful anti-money laundering efforts was U.S. efforts against Al-Qaeda right now after 9/11 that very significantly reduced legal financial flows to Al-Qaeda from, for example, construction activities, other businesses in the Middle East. And those did have an effect on reducing Al-Qaeda's capacity, but it's a very different proposal. Of course, Al-Qaeda ultimately adapted by both switching its model to franchises as well as by tapping into other financial flows, for example, continual charity donations from the Middle East. But it's a very different proposition to focus anti-money laundering efforts on a group than it is to take money out of the drug trade.
Mm-hmm. Okay, we are reaching the beginning of the end, or the end of the beginning. And let me see if I have summarized your message. I think that what you have been saying here today is that neither legalization of drugs nor solidly supply reduction efforts really catches the problem, which is the moving targets. That instead we should focus more on capacity building and nation building, and to address the underlying vulnerabilities in local communities that make people people susceptible to crime, and it legitimizes criminal groups. And I think that actually resonates very well with the rest of the conference and the program we had yesterday, because we talked a lot about how do you prevent young people from actually wanting to take drugs or seeking drugs. And it's in many cases, it's an indirect approach. And afterwards, after lunch, we'll hear about the story of Iceland, how they, through community-based actions, managed to designate or create a society in which the need to engage in drug-seeking behavior is quite low. And also we've heard about recovery cities and the different recovery initiatives that make people actually want to step out of drug addiction. And that also has very much to do with how you create an environment, a local environment in which people are progressed or their move away from a life in addiction is being facilitated. So I think we are onto something, and I'm very happy that you gave us this interview. If you would like to add something to that.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. You will get a robot, Vanda. It's a robot, and it's being made by people in recovery who went off drugs and crime.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.